For a few reasons, a sequel to the Talos Principle always seemed like a tall order. The ending, at least the canon ending, was just about as open-ended as endings can get. Exiting the simulation and stepping out onto a balcony, the android you've controlled for the past few hours is shown a civilization in decay. Biological humans are gone, and as the only self-aware being on Earth, what the android is supposed to do, and what it even can do, is left unanswered. Besides that, the Talos Principle's puzzles exist in a somewhat rigid space, cordoned off and organized into specific rooms where you're given specific tools. In the Talos Principle, you are almost literally playing a game within a game, meaning the simulation has the same disconnection with its outside world that games in real life do. So, with a lone android exploring the ruins of human civilization and equipped with nothing but the will to live, how would you incorporate dedicated puzzle rooms and physics-breaking technology into a dead world? As it turns out, not only is all that possible, but developer Crow Team, along with writers Jonas and Verena Kyratzes and Tom Jubert, have pieced together a follow-up that sits among the greatest sequels in video game history. The Talos Principle 2 returns us to an Earth whose only self-aware inhabitants are a small group of androids, the legacy of the first and only android to exit the simulation. In the years since the end of the first game, these androids, with the ability to live lives lasting beyond 1,000 years, have developed a small civilization all their own. New Jerusalem, their only city, is made of bright white materials and wide, obtuse curves. Despite the segments that are still under construction, it's a city that, from afar, seems like a paradise. But inside, the androids are grappling with similar material problems that plagued their biological forerunners. You are the 1,000th member of this society, born at the beginning of the game and nicknamed 1K by the other androids. 1K's birth is a major event for the city. As the story goes, the android from the first game, after leaving the simulation, took the name Athena and began work on creating more androids. To avoid the mistakes of their creators, Athena commanded that only 1,000 androids would be built. It's what the androids refer to as the goal. But Athena has disappeared, and with the city facing power and material shortages, two competing visions for the future of New Jerusalem have emerged. One that supports growth and expansion, and the other that prioritizes adherence to the goal. This all collides soon after 1K is born. A being calling itself Prometheus tells the androids to follow its signal to a far-off island. With 1K in tow, the androids send a small team of explorers to investigate the message and the island's mysteries, setting the people of New Jerusalem on a path to determine the future of their small civilization. There is a lot going on in Talos Principle 2. Embedded in the narrative are allusions to religion, internet culture, and art criticism. In certain contexts, it's not inaccurate to say that it is a game about everything. There are mysteries within mysteries, and like the first game, scattered terminals with excerpts from multiple writers and philosophers, like Oscar Wilde and G.K. Chesterton, touching on a variety of subjects. As the simulation's lead programmer, the legacy of Alexandra Drennan looms large over the people of New Jerusalem. There's even a memorial dedicated to her work and the time capsules she recorded for the simulation. This time around, the recordings you'll find are from Trevor Donovan, another of the simulation's developers. Trevor may not speak with the same elegance as Alexandra, but his thoughtfulness and passion for art and humanity are just as insightful and entertaining. And what links the two characters is their sincerity and staunch belief in humanity's goodness. Trevor is also a fan of John Carpenter, which is always a plus. So Talos Principle 2 gives you plenty to think about and lots of space to do so. It is a gorgeous game to walk through. The architecture and art direction I do have slightly mixed feelings about. The scale of the island's structures is grand and the designs of its buildings are interesting, but I do miss the simulation's pseudo-historical settings. The simulation's ruins of old and ancient civilizations evoke a sense of myth and mortality. The art direction in Talos Principle 2 is more modern and even abstract, which is fine, but it lacks a certain mystique, and the environments, while visually nice, are not as distinct and different as they were in the simulation. Depending on how you interpret certain things, there might be a narrative reason for the architecture to look this way, and in its defense, Talos Principle 2 isn't concerned as much with humanity's past as it is with its future. Composer Damjan Mravunac returns and produces another fantastic soundtrack that pairs perfectly with contemplative puzzling, though I'm not sure it's implemented as well this time around. As you're out exploring, songs will, seemingly without reason, fade into other tracks, like there's someone you don't see pressing the next button. It's a small thing, but noticeable. The premise of Talos Principle 2 alone is interesting, and I've never come away from a game before wishing for a novelization. The androids of New Jerusalem consider themselves human. They customize the color of their bodies and choose names, genders, and voices. It's something one android I know might call
intriguing.
The society these humans have built is expressive and highly communicative. There's a social media page where androids chime in on events that happen during the game, and as you explore the mysterious island, 1K and the rest of the expedition team share Zoom-like video chats and selfies. The profile pictures they use express something about their interests and who they are. What is a relatively new paradigm of communication and culture to real-life humans is a medium the humans in Talos Principle 2 were born into and seem to engage with on a more sincere level. Yet, despite their technological and digital construction, these humans apparently still see value in physical space. They still use analog instruments to make music and meet in person to talk. New Jerusalem has museums dedicated to the history of the simulation, as well as artifacts once used by biological humans. They even recreate a few puzzles from the simulation using hardwood cutouts and paint, an endearing tribute to the past. Part of what made the first Talos Principle so charming was its balance of thoughtful philosophy and fun-loving playfulness. There's a level where you can read Kant, and not too far away, find an Easter egg where a coconut falls on your head. That joyful and otherworldly feeling you get from breaking out of a game's intended play space and seeing what's behind the proverbial curtain, Talos Principle implements on purpose. There are Easter eggs and special puzzles that require you to break the rules the game sets for its normal puzzles. It all fits nicely around a larger narrative about creativity, experimentation, and play. Things that Alexandra and the other developers of the simulation thought were important to impart on whatever consciousness would arise from their work. Talos Principle 2 has a similar structure to it, and there are plenty of well-hidden Easter eggs. The mysterious island 1K and their fellow explorers travel to is split into 12 open-ended sections surrounding a giant pyramid. Signage points you toward puzzles, and your compass gives you the direction for points of interest. If you really want to immerse yourself, you can disable the compass and explore these maps on your own. Puzzles work with the same principles they did in the first game, sectioned off into individual spaces with specific tools you'll need to use to reach a console at the end. New devices like the driller create holes in specific walls, and the teleporter will get you through windows, gates, and driller holes. In some puzzles, you'll have to swap control between two different bodies, somewhat similar to the first game's recording and playback mechanic. How these and the rest of Talos Principle 2's tools work together is all part of a larger gameplay arc that involves experimentation and foresight. In the first game, puzzle difficulty is communicated via color: green for easy, yellow for moderate, and red for difficult. Talos Principle 2 has no color coding, but generally speaking, it felt to me that the higher the number was, the more difficult the puzzle. As you might expect, an area's first puzzle acts as a quasi-tutorial, teaching you how to use a new tool without explicitly saying it's teaching you. As later puzzles become more complex, you'll have to think of creative ways to use tools that may not be apparent from the beginning. It's great game design I thoroughly enjoyed that, a couple times, also had me thoroughly stumped. As a result of this, though, Talos Principle 2's difficulty does feel somewhat arbitrary, but that's not a criticism. There were puzzles with multiple steps and tools I figured out in just a few minutes, and others with fewer steps that took me longer. Way longer. To be honest, why I find certain puzzles difficult and others easy, I'm not even sure. Talos Principle 2 got me thinking about how my own brain works and why certain puzzles came so easily while others were such a struggle. For the most part, it seems like there's usually only one way to solve a puzzle, but there were a couple times it certainly seemed like I solved the puzzle with an unintended secondary solution, though I can't say for sure. The first game has really intuitive design as well as clear audio cues and other feedback that makes it clear what tools are doing and whether or not objects are activated. Talos Principle 2 has all that same feedback, and even with that rigidity, experimentation and creativity are still rewarded, and getting all the pieces set in place and working as intended is just as satisfying a second time around. As you progress, a pattern sets in that repeats throughout most of the game. Each area surrounding the pyramid has a centerpiece, a massive structure that's accessible only once enough puzzles have been solved. Once you solve those puzzles, you then build a bridge to the structure with tetrominoes, and once inside, activate a laser that connects with the pyramid. What is inside the pyramid, what the pyramid's purpose is, where all these massive structures came from, and how they were all built is unknown, and the people of New Jerusalem disagree on whether or not looking for answers is wise. As you solve puzzles, Prometheus, Pandora, and the Sphinx, three beings with unknown intentions and origins, appear and interrogate 1K's motives and philosophical opinions, each with attitudes that match their myths and legends. Pandora is skeptical of 1K's quest and human ambition. To her, hope is dangerous, and the pyramid a box that can't be shut once it's opened. The Sphinx is characteristically enigmatic and inquisitive. Prometheus unequivocally supports 1K's efforts, something made manifest with his Promethean flames that, if you find enough, you can use to skip tough puzzles. Pandora and the Sphinx have side puzzles of their own as well, unlocking other answers. The theme here is pretty straightforward. As fire burns, it also illuminates. Solving the island's mysteries could prove to be a source of knowledge and empowerment, but it could also prove to be dangerous and deadly. 1K's traveling companions give voice to the concerns and hopes of what the island is and the answers it could provide. Byron is the leader of the expedition. He's unafraid of the unknown, curious, and maybe a little brash. Alcatraz is second in command, but he's at the opposite end of Byron. If his name isn't a dead giveaway, Alcatraz is conservative, skeptical, and measured. Sitting somewhere in the middle, Yakut is curious and thoughtful, and Melville is an elbow-greased engineer with an appropriately colored body. Getting to know these characters is a lot of fun, and the excellent transformations they go through during the game are driven in no small part by outstanding dialogue and stellar performances. They are consummate researchers and scientists, but they're also human with faults and emotions. The two broad philosophical camps Talos Principle 2 creates, growth versus sustainability, the dangers of new technologies versus the opportunities they create, are ideas these characters wrestle with in believably human ways. On this central conflict, Talos Principle 2 does, I think, have an opinion of its own. It is not impartially presenting a story about two opposed viewpoints and allowing players to figure it out themselves. But at the same time, it doesn't shortchange or undercut its characters. Great writing gives each of their opinions, fears, and hopes real room, and characters I personally disagreed with I also came to respect and even like. There are a few religious zealots in New Jerusalem, but some characters have legitimate traumas. Their hesitations, fears, and anxieties come from realistic and understandable places, coloring their reactions to 1K's discoveries. Being a game set after the extinction of biological humans, there is an air of remorse, sadness, and regret. When these characters confront and are confused by the evil and apathy of the humans that came before, Talos Principle 2 is clearly speaking about the present. But the game also refuses to get lost in that malaise. Talos Principle 2 is ultimately humanist and optimistic. More than merely refusing to go quietly into the night, Talos Principle 2 chooses to understand it. In a universe that is chaotic, meaningless, and terrifyingly vast, it chooses to find joy in its mathematical and aesthetic beauty, and to see its dark, unknown corners as opportunities. To make one final Star Trek reference, if humans were meant to fly, we'd have wings, but we discovered we had to. And if not at least for the sake of a possible Talos Principle 3, I hope the humans of New Jerusalem make the same choice.